certainly not surprising given today's topic, the best global travel websites. Today, Lionbridge has invited John Juncker, co-founder and president of Byte Level Research, to present key findings from his analysis of global travel and hospitality websites. John actually founded Byte Level Research in 2000 to specifically focus on web globalization, and in that capacity helps global companies improve their websites and global usability. John authored the first book ever devoted to web globalization, titled Beyond Borders, Web Globalization Strategies, and has written a number of landmark reports, including the annual Web Globalization Report Card that a lot of us look forward to receiving each year. And I believe this is the third year that Lionbridge has partnered with John on a specific industry analysis of global websites. So today's webinar is brought to you by the Lionbridge Travel and Hospitality team. Lionbridge is a leader in translation and localization services, and the travel and hospitality practice was built to specifically address the unique needs of the travel industry. That team has been working with some of the largest and leading brands in the space, providing a full suite of localization services, from content and website translation to international SEO, video production localization, to web publishing and global social media. But enough. Everybody on the line wants to get right to the content, as do I. So at this time, I'm going to hand the reins over to John Juncker. So John, it's all yours.
Thank you, Clint, and thank you, Lionbridge, for hosting this call and sponsoring this research. I do really enjoy focusing on this sector. I cover all industry sectors, but the travel and hospitality industry is particularly interesting from a web and mobile globalization perspective because it's among the most innovative, and you'll see why in this presentation. What I'm going to go over over the next hour, first focus on who are the best within this sector in terms of web globalization. Talk a little bit about best practices from language to global navigation. And then I'm going to briefly look at four companies, Hotels.com, KLM, Hertz, and the visitor bureau, DiscoverAmerica.com. And then talk a little bit about social and mobile developments. And then finally, I would love to take questions from all of you. And so please send them in, write them down, and if I can't even get to them on this call, I promise I will follow up. Questions are always, to me, the most interesting part of these presentations. So please don't hesitate to ask. So I love the travel industry because it's so global, and I included this visual. This is from 2012, UN World Tourism Organization, and this little pie chart just shows inbound international travelers, and you can see how it's dispersed. Europe taking over half of the inbound travelers, but it's really interesting to see this and to get a look at the trends in this industry. And first off, there are now more than 1 billion people traveling internationally each year, with that number projected to hit 1.8 billion by 2030. And what's really interesting is that the emerging economies are really taking off from an international tourist perspective. So it's conventionally companies within this industry would focus on a few key developed markets for their marketing and web localization efforts. Today, you really are taking a more global perspective when you look at where your potential customers live and where they're coming from and where they're going to. So it really is a challenging time from a global perspective. And this statistic that by 2030, 5 million people will be crossing the borders between countries every day is just a kind of staggering statistic from my perspective. So clearly, we're living in a time where people are traveling more than ever and more internationally than ever. So that's exciting, but I would also, that leads me to this next slide, is any industry more challenging than travel? And this is why I think not just travel companies are being challenged, but the challenges that are hitting this industry are really are hitting other industries to varying degrees. But the challenges run the gamut from first e-commerce. What's really interesting here is you have to not only deal with different currencies and payment methods, but you have fraud mitigation challenges, which is particularly challenging because you're dealing with travelers. So you can't assume that if someone's paying from one country that they necessarily live in that country, and that adds a layer of complexity. Customer support is an enormous challenge. Not only do you have the linguistic issues, but you have very time-sensitive questions and demands. And of course, you have to follow the sun in terms of how you support users around the world. You have platform challenges. This to me, from a web globalization perspective, is very interesting, and I'm going to hit on this again and again, is that you have users who may purchase a ticket on their desktop and then expect to cash it in to transact that ticket using their smartphone. And how you manage that scenario and similar scenarios across devices is particularly exciting and challenging. You have geo challenges. What types of location-specific services are you providing? And one thing that a lot of companies still overlook, and they really should not, is slow wireless connections. Even in the U.S. and in developed markets, when you get into an airport, these are heavily taxed wireless networks, so even the so-called 4G networks sometimes perform not up to speed. So you cannot make assumptions that everyone has a broadband connection, and particularly when you start to look globally and look at users around the world. And finally, you have social challenges. Travelers get very social when things don't quite work out, when their bags don't show up, or when their room isn't available. And managing this is an ongoing challenge in terms of how you engage with the community and how you support users through social media. And I really want to emphasize here, this is not an issue just for companies that have global aspirations. If you're a U.S.-focused brand, or these statistics on this chart are fascinating to me. What you see here are the number of visits to the United States in the millions, and Canada is number one, followed by Mexico. But to the right of that, you see the rankings and how those have changed from 2012 to 2013. And Canada was ranked number 3, and now they're ranked number 1. But what's interesting is you go down this list, you see Brazil has just rocketed up this list from 15th place to 5th place, and China is also moving up this list. So your assumptions about who is visiting the U.S., you have to expand your assumptions, and of course you're going to have to expand the languages you support. So questions you need to ask are, where are my customers now and in the future coming from? How do I greet them? How does my website respond when it detects visitors from outside the U.S.? And what are you doing? Do you have a strategy in place? It's not just language, but it's how do you greet them? Where do you take them when they hit your website? What is their experience going to be? So I want to first mention the report card, because the methodology I used for this research focused on the travel sector is similar to what I use for the report card. And it's a very high-level methodology. It is basically every website gets 100 points, and it's broken down into 4 sectors. Global navigation, which is how users seamlessly users find their localized content. The global mobile architecture. Now this has to do with how world-ready your website and your mobile app is. Global reach quite simply refers to languages, what languages you support. Obviously the more languages the better, and I'll talk more about that. And then finally, localization and social has to do with the cultural customization, the depth of localized content, and the degree to which you engage with customers through local social media. So based on that, this chart on the right represents the top 25 from this year's report card. And I included here because you'll notice there are 4 travel sector companies in the top 25. Historically, tech companies have dominated this list, and there's a lot of reasons for this. Many tech companies have been localizing their software products for many, many years. So they have the skill set in-house, they have processes in place, so they've generally been ahead of the curve. The travel industry over the past decade has made significant inroads. But what you'll notice on this list as we work down, we have Hotels.com, Booking.com, moving on down, TripAdvisor, and then Kayak. These are basically software companies still dominating this list. But what's interesting when I did this research this time around is that I am seeing great improvements from the airlines and the hotel properties, and so I think this is going to get a lot more competitive in the next few years. So that's going to be very interesting to see play out. So for this report, for the Lionbridge report, I looked at 50 companies across the following sectors. Really just a broad overview. Could not cover all airlines, all cruise lines, but we tried to look at a good representative sampling. And out of those 50 companies, here were the top 15 websites. You'll recognize the top 4. Those were in the top 25 from the report card. And then we get into KLM, Hertz, Expedia, and you have a nice mix of hotels, cruise lines, airlines. And I'm going to focus on a few of these companies later in this report. And if you have any specific questions about these particular websites, send a question. And of course, the report itself is going to say quite a bit more about some of these leading websites. So let's talk about languages. When I started doing the report card 10 years ago, if I came across a website that supported 10 languages, that was a quote-unquote global website. Companies were very proud at the time to have supported 10 languages, and frankly, it was no trivial feat 10 years ago to get the budgets to really to globalize to that extent. But clearly, the benchmark has risen. This chart is the average number of languages from the 150 websites studied over the many years. And you can see the steady rise from roughly 12 in 2005 to we're about 28, 29 languages in 2014. That's just the average. And that is a significant number for a lot of companies. And I realize a lot of companies on this call, you may not be there yet. But I throw this out there is when you start to think in this many languages, it starts to change how you think about your globalization strategy, in terms of how you manage scale, how you manage the process and the workflow. And these are questions that it's better to start asking when you're at 5 languages than when you're at 20 languages. This visual here looks at the overall language leaders, not in the travel sector, but from the report card. And at the top we have Wikipedia. And Wikipedia I always include as a great example of the potential number of languages you might support when you open it up to the crowd. And this is user-generated content at 285 languages. Google at 145 languages, that is the search interface only. Google actually supports considerably fewer when you look at apps such as Gmail and YouTube, where it runs from 40 to 60 languages. But when you get into the more standard websites, the less service-oriented websites, Honda, DHL, Coca-Cola, you start to flatten out around 40 languages, and that really is the ceiling for most multinational companies outside of the software or web services sectors. And as you go down this list, I have the average global website at 29. Most websites anywhere from 2 to 5 languages roughly. And then finally I included Google Translate. And I think it's interesting. I'm not going to talk a lot about machine translation, but Google Translate now supports roughly, last time I checked, 80 language pairs. That is a significant number. And what that means is that users around the world are, if you don't translate your website for them, odds are they're going to do it for themselves using Google Translate or Microsoft Translate. And that is something to consider, because if you do it for them, odds are you're going to do a lot better job translating that content than they will on their own. So, and not only that, users are using these machine translation applications, and their expectations, their level of expectations about having their language supported, those expectations are. So just keep that in mind as you think about how you're serving your audience. The language is supported within the travel sector. Now, just within those 50 companies I looked at, the average is around 11 languages. So it's considerably lower. There's only one company at over 40, and that's Booking.com, followed by Hotels.com. And then you get into KLM, Avis, TripAdvisor. So it drops off pretty quickly. So there's still a lot of room for growth in this sector. A lot of companies that are still really just getting started, even though they're global in terms of reach already. They have hotel properties around the world. They support global customers around the world. They're still just getting started from a web and mobile globalization perspective. And I can tell you from conversations I've had with a number of these companies over the past year, there's a lot of activity. These numbers are all going up. Now, what languages should you support? This is not a clear-cut, easy question to answer, because it really depends on your strategy, your existing customers and your future customers. This pie chart is roughly represents the native languages of the roughly 2.7 billion internet users today. You can see Chinese is the #1 language. English is no longer the dominant language of native speakers on the internet. And then if you work your way around this pie chart, you see the standard world languages, the Spanish, the Portuguese, German, and Russian. And then you see Vietnamese and Indonesian. And actually, I'm going to go back here. I want to focus on Indonesian here. Indonesian is an extremely hot language these days. First off, this market is one of the top 5 markets in terms of population on the world. So it's one of the largest populated countries on this planet. It's also very popular. The mobile penetration in this market is very high. So it is not unusual for a company that's new, that's a startup company that's very mobile focused. They might, for example, do Indonesian, Vietnamese, Turkish before they do Italian. Conventionally, the way web globalization worked was companies would start on developed markets and the languages within those markets and then work to emerging markets. I can tell you right now that model doesn't hold necessarily as it used to. So you don't have to, as you go ahead with your strategy, focus on where the growth, if you're focusing on growth, you can't ignore markets like in Indonesia and Turkey. Now, one of the most important best practices in web globalization is global consistency, and that illustrates itself through the global template. And I include here Booking.com, and I've got 3 different country websites. They all use the same template. It's a flexible template. It's heavily text-based. There's not a lot of text that's been embedded within visuals, which makes it easier and more cost-effective to translate. When I talk about scale, a global template, heavily text-based template allows that to happen. And when you start to think about your design, your web design, or your web redesign, look at companies like Booking.com, Hotels.com, and look at what they're doing and learn from them. Because it really does, when you might be at 5 languages today, but if you're planning to get to 25 languages, you want a template that is really translation friendly. And not only that, machine translation friendly. Because as I mentioned, users, Booking.com does not support 80 languages, but a user might want to self-translate into a language they don't support. Well, if it's largely text-based, they can do that for themselves. Now, one pushback I get sometimes are that if we use global templates, it's not going to work with all our different brands. You know, different brands or properties, they want to do their own thing. I counter with examples such as this from IHG, Intercontinental Hotels Group. They have a number of brands that are distinct but related, and you can see here I've got Holiday Inn, I've got Staybridge Suites, and Indigo, Hotel Indigo. They're all using under the surface the same structural, the same general architecture, same general template. So you can have visually distinct brands and websites that still reuse underlying templates. And if you do get pushback from various teams or to various properties, it's important to still keep pushing for template reuse. I'm a big fan of not reinventing the wheel. Local offices, brands should be spending more time on content and promotion and less time on these high-level architecture issues. Now, global navigation, the global gateway, is an area that is very challenging, but also an area that you can make some significant progress relatively easily. And it is amazing how many companies overlook this. They take a very U.S. or domestic market approach to how their website interacts with the world. So I recommend developing a global gateway strategy, and there are 4 elements that companies can employ. And first, I recommend country codes. Now, country codes can effectively be the front door to your website, and a lot of companies do this, and I'll show some examples. In a perfect world, you use country code, and then say a user in Brazil, they use .br, they go straight to their localized website. Now let's say users go to .com, they go to your global homepage. Now how do they self-navigate to their localized website? Well, you need a visual global gateway. You need something that users can see and interact with and quickly get to where they want to go. You don't want to lose people. Right now, most companies that I talk to, most multinationals, between 50 and 70% of their visitors to their .com websites originate from outside of their domestic market. So it is, you think of .com as in effect like an international airline terminal. You have people from all over the world rushing through. They just want to get to where they want to go, and your visual global gateway allows them to do that. There are 2 back-end or technical solutions you can use as well. Geolocation, which looks at the IP address of the computer or mobile phone, and language negotiation, which looks at the language setting of the web browser. You can use one or the other. They are not perfect solutions, but they can be highly effective, and companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter have used them relatively successfully over the years. So country codes. Of the 50 websites reviewed for this report, 18 websites would do what I call are average to above average, in my opinion, in terms of their support for country codes. And these are some notable websites that support country codes. And sometimes you just can't get access to a certain country code. And a good example here is Amazon. Amazon goes the extra step of integrating the country code into its logo, which I think is an excellent idea, particularly from an e-commerce perspective. I highlighted .se for Sweden because it's been reported that Amazon has not yet secured that country code and wants to before it launches its localized website. And in the travel sector, Travelocity is one example of a travel company that's done that. Now the visual global gateway, it should be prominently displayed and consistently displayed. In this Sheraton header, you'll notice a globe icon in the upper right on the header there. I love that globe icon. It can be used to indicate language or location or both. You know, and it's a neutral icon, and I can talk more about why that's neutral later in the call. Royal Caribbean uses a globe icon. I'm a big fan of the globe because it displays well on small sizes. It speaks to users. It communicates its purpose to users regardless of the language they speak, and that's important to have something visual there that users can go to, click on, and then find their global gateway menu. Now, geolocation does work, and it can work really, really well, but you really need to use it carefully. First off, you want to have a visual global gateway in place before you start using geolocation or language negotiation. What you see here, this is Expedia. So if I am in Japan and I go to Expedia.com, Expedia is guesstimating here. It's saying it's taking me to Japan, the Japan site, because it's detected I'm based in Japan. But as you can see in the header, it gives me a way to continue on to Expedia.com. So it's trying to be helpful, but it's not entirely sure that I want to go to the Japanese website. So I can still override what it's doing. Of the 50 websites, 20 are now using geolocation to varying capacities to help users find their local content. I'm personally a fan of not overriding user intent. I'm going to show here an example from Amazon. Now, for a web user in Germany who inputs Amazon.com, that person will go to Amazon.com. However, what you'll see here is an image in implement flag and just a brief note that basically says, hey, do you know we also offer a localized website? And the difference here is what Amazon's doing is it's honoring the user's input, but still making the localized website discoverable. And I think this is a better strategy personally, but you're going to see a wide gamut, and you really just need to test out what's going to work best for your users. And the travel sector in particular is very challenging because you have users who are on the move. So you can have a customer who's in France. You can't assume they speak French. You can't assume they live in France. They could be an American or a German traveling into France. So that's why global navigation is so interesting when it comes to this particular sector. One general bit of advice, IHG here, you'll notice this pull-down menu. This is actually their global gateway menu, and it has been over-translated, which is a mistake, because the global gateway menu has to be universally accessible, and I'll show you an example of that. This is what Microsoft does. I call it a universal global gateway because each of the localized websites, the links here, are presented in the local language, assuming that language is supported within that market, and in these cases they are. So you will see a variety of scripts in Chinese, Arabic, etc. And what's nice about this gateway is that it doesn't have to change. It can be used across all of the localized websites. I'm including also an example from Kayak, and these are 3 different gateways from 3 different websites. And just put aside the flags. I'll talk about the flags in a second. But if you just look at the country names, you'll notice they're consistent. So it doesn't matter if you're on Germany or Russia. The gateway itself largely stays static. So let's take a look at a few companies. Hotels.com, very consistent. They've done a very good job with using a global template, and global templates really well executed. They free you up to focus on content and functionality for the user, which is of most importance for these websites. Hotels.com also provides a mobile website and a mobile app. And it's interesting, they're not exactly similar. Here's this, on the left is the website, on the right is the mobile app. The differences are largely because when you have a mobile app, you can do more. You can provide a lot of the visuals. Caching can be done within the mobile environment, whereas the mobile website, you're relying purely on the internet connection to deliver everything. So you'll notice it's a little more scaled down, which is good. It is a good thing to see that because it's all about performance, particularly in mobile. But still, these two home pages do, generally look alike and generally help you achieve very similar goals. Hotels.com uses geolocation and language negotiation. Shown here, if I am using a web browser that is set to English and I am in Japan, I will see this screen. And it seems a little complicated, but what Hotels.com is doing is it's keeping the UI, the display, the homepage in English because it knows my browser is set to English, but it's also taking me to the Japanese website. Granted, I recommend generally not overriding the input of the user, but I can see what Hotels.com is doing here, and it's clearly, and it, of course, that little message in the top allows users to quickly change, know that they can quickly change the UI language as well, if they wish. This is an example if you're a Spanish-speaking web user within the U.S. Your browser is set to Spanish. You go to Hotels.com. You're still on the U.S. website, but you're seeing a Spanish language UI. So that's language negotiation at work. Now, the global gateway and the currency gateway. There's two interesting things going on right now, not only with Hotels.com, but Booking.com. Now, these two companies, as I've noted in the report, they are very similar. They're very competitive, and you can see them. Over the years, they've really been pushing themselves along, and it's exciting to see that level of competition, not only in terms of languages, but in terms of just how they're iterating on their web design and their functionality. And it appears they're doing something very similar here. And actually, Kayak does something along these lines as well, but it's most evident when you look at Booking.com and Hotels.com. They basically stick their global gateway next to the currency gateway. And they have abstracted their website in such a way that you can change currencies and you can change, just like you can change your country. And it is a very sophisticated model. There are more companies looking at this type of a model where currency is much more flexible along the lines of country. It is challenging, and I wouldn't recommend it for all companies. I think you kind of have to crawl before you walk and before you run. These companies are at the running stage, but it is something to be aware of. And I also want to talk about the flags, because this question comes up a lot. What do I think about the flags? I personally recommend not using flags if you can avoid using flags. I've got here a screen grab from the global gateway for Apple, and I believe Apple has had a lot to do with a lot of companies using flags. Apple is widely viewed as very strong from a UI usability perspective, but I think Apple is wrong in this regard. I think this is not in the user's best interest. I don't think flags are always that user-friendly. First off, flags should never be used to indicate language, ever. They don't. You cannot. There's no flag for the Spanish language. There's no flag for the English language. And that's still a very common mistake that companies make through their websites. Secondly, flags carry significant cultural baggage. Sometimes that's positive baggage, but not always. And sometimes a resident of one country might not view the flag of another country as valid, and that can be irritating. And that has come up with China and Taiwan. It can be an issue with Kosovo, as another example. There are a lot of geopolitical issues associated with flags. So that's another warning flag, if you will, regarding flags. Flags limit your reach. When you use flags, you're saying to the user, we are limiting this website to within these country borders. And that's important as well because you might not want to limit your reach. And as in the Apple example here, I don't believe flags scale well. When you have that many, I don't believe, I've yet to see a study that shows that helps users find their country link more quickly. Now, having said all that, I do believe flags can convey a positive sense of home. And this is where I think flags are less effective for navigational purposes, but can be very effective from an e-commerce perspective, which is why I would suppose and guess that Hotels.com and Booking.com do use flags, because when it comes to actually purchasing something, there is a level of comfort for the user to know that they're on the right home page. Okay, KLM. KLM is now in the process of launching a new responsive global template. It's heavily text-based. You can see here, this is a shrunken, as you have a smaller device screen form factor, you lose a lot of the right page, and it just kind of shrinks down to just the reservation engine. KLM has been heavily invested in languages. They support 26, which is well ahead of American Airlines and British Airlines. And KLM has been heavily invested in social through Facebook. And this screen grab is actually from one of their websites, and you can see they've actually gone beyond just simply having a like button. They've actually excerpted a bit of the Facebook wall on their page. And I think that's a great strategy. I do think I'd like to see KLM perhaps try to avoid the mix of languages you see here, but what they're doing is definitely on the right track. And what's also interesting, this is from KLM Mobile. You'll notice the German flag here, and navigation on mobile devices in terms of the global gateway is very challenging, and KLM is the only mobile website that has actually made the gateway this visible, and that to me is a positive sign for users. On the desktop, KLM has some room to improve. You'll see here when you first visit KLM.com, there's a subset of available localized websites there. I'm not a fan of this approach. I believe this shows preference for some countries over others. So that's not a good signal that you want to send to the world. Furthermore, once you get into the gateway itself, it's an alpha sorted gateway. So it's Latin, it's biased to the Latin script. It's a cumbersome gateway to use. Now Hertz. Hertz was one of the earlier companies within the sector to really embrace a responsive website. And not just responsive for one market, but for all markets. And so we have two country websites here. They're responsive, so here we have the desktop screens, and this is what it looks like on a much smaller screen. And what's interesting is as you shrink it down, you get right to the functionality. What's interesting also as well, these screens are the most challenging part of any web localization process when you deal with functionality, software, and data input, data output. You'll notice if you really look at these two screens, you'll notice the variables have changed. On the US side, you have to select an age, where you may not have to on another localized website. So there's a lot of variables that have to be considered when it comes to localizing a reservation engine. So when you think about a responsive website, mobile in particular, as a general rule, as your real estate shrinks, your functionality expands. So you'll notice not just with Hertz, but with KLM, when you get into these small form factors, it's all about functionality. There's not a lot of bells and whistles. There's no useless visuals. It's just functionality. Visuals are a luxury, and if they are not necessary, leave them out. And responding to the device finally is just one step of many. You need to consider the scenarios as well that that device is being used to support. Hertz's global gateway, it's a two-part gateway shown here. The user's asked to first select country, then language. I'm not a fan of the two-part gateway, and that's a very common gateway in the travel sector, unfortunately. And also, you'll notice here that it's been over-translated. So, you know, Hertz has done a very good job, but could still improve on the gateway. And finally, Discover America is a visitor bureau promoting USA, and very consistently for the most part. I have two different country websites here, and not totally consistently. Here's the China site geared towards Chinese users. There's a different URL as well. I do want to mention here, one thing that comes up with a lot of multinationals is global consistency is important, and I do recommend it, but don't feel like you have to be consistent if you have a very strong, very sophisticated office in, say, Japan or China or Korea, and they've made a compelling case for doing something a little bit different. Definitely strive for being as globally consistent as you can be, but when it comes to Asia, I've often found that those markets can often make a very strong and compelling case for doing things a little bit differently, and I'm happy to talk more about that later. But so just be aware that there sometimes are exceptions to the rule, and those are valid exceptions. I mentioned flags and how they limit reach. This is a good example here. As you can see, the English and the Spanish links, you're indicating Spanish and English languages, but because of the flags, Mexico and the UK, the reach is limited. And that may very well be by intent, but that is the message being conveyed to users. USA does a great job of supporting blogs. I'm a huge fan of blogs, of content that is in the local language that goes beyond purely marketing content. Discover America also supports a number of local language social feeds. This is from their website. It's for Korea, and you can see here they've got a fair number of followers for their Korea Twitter feed, and here is their Brazilian feed, and these are all in the local language. And I love to see this. It's a lot of work. I realize maintaining these are not trivial, but the engagement level when users know that they can communicate with you in their local language and you'll respond in their local language, the engagement level is significantly higher. User-generated content is extremely valuable, and TripAdvisor, this is a screen grab from TripAdvisor, their entire business is largely built on customer-generated content in the form of reviews. And they have been very aggressive about soliciting reviews in all languages. And what's interesting here, this is just a little thing I wanted to show you, is you now have the option of looking at reviews in a variety of languages based on what languages those reviews are available in. This is clearly geared toward a niche audience of bilingual, multilingual users, but it's just a nice feature, and it's a very sophisticated feature. Because as TripAdvisor well knows, people need to see a certain number of reviews before they'll make a decision on booking a property. So they're not just limiting you to one language. If you want to see everything in English and Italian, you can do that. You have that power. Now, mobile language, the number of languages supported by mobile apps tend to follow the number of languages supported by the desktop websites. And I've got the leaders here on this visual. Booking.com from 2013-14 has gone from 22 to 36 languages, followed by Hotels.com, TripAdvisor, and Expedia. Those are the 4 language leaders in terms of mobile apps. Few companies, not just within travel, but across the board, few companies provide language parity across their websites and their mobile apps. And this is unfortunate to me. I think you can imagine, you know, these are the 4 leaders, these 4 companies, but imagine a user whose language is supported on their desktop, they interact with your website in their language, and then they go to the airport or they go to your hotel, and suddenly their language is not supported in the mobile app. That is a huge, huge inconvenience, and I'd like to see more examples of companies providing a true linguistic parity across the platforms. So finally, I just want to summarize with some general web globalization best practices. First off, if you can support 30 or more languages, I realize that's aggressive for a lot of companies, but if you can, you're going to be in very, very good company, and obviously you'll be supporting a significantly global reach. Always engage with your local offices, if you have them, to solicit local requirements and use cases early on. This is really important. This is a true bottom-up web localization. You have to have the local offices engaged to really be successful in terms of web globalization. Maximize design template reuse and code reuse whenever possible. Provide a consistent and prominent global gateway. Be locally relevant and functional. It's not just enough to provide the language support, but also provide the functional support that users need in their market. And if you can, support the local language social networks. Platform parity, very important. I've mentioned that. And then finally, I think I'm starting to see this more, and I really want to emphasize this. It's not just about translation. Translation is incredibly important, but it's not just about the words you're translating. It's about the usage scenarios you're supporting. And the words you translate support those scenarios. But if you take a more scenario-based approach to web localization, you're going to ultimately be more successful with those localized websites, because they won't just be about, well, we translated 20 web pages and we're done. It'll be more about, well, we now have localized these websites so users can do this, they can do this, and they can do this. And whatever word count, whatever translation needs to happen to make that possible happens. So with that, I'd love to take any questions that you have.
Great. Thanks, John. I think on behalf of everyone, I thank you for a lot of food for thought that you gave all of us. And certainly some folks have been pinging us with questions as you were presenting. We have a good amount of time here, about 10 minutes in the allotted scheduled time to cover those, but I would encourage those of you on the line to continue to submit questions, because as John said, even if we don't get to it here in the live session, we'll follow up with a response. So let's dig into it. Early on, John, someone asked, is it wise to automatically set the website language based on the user's browser preferences, or should you always enable them to, I believe, choose a language explicitly?
Yeah, language negotiation. So you're looking at the language browser and you're responding in kind with your website. It is, I think it's generally a good idea. It's particularly a good idea with mobile. And I say this because with mobile devices, the users almost never change their language settings. So it's a much more personal device. The language setting of your mobile phone is the language you prefer. So language negotiation is particularly valuable for mobile scenarios. For desktop scenarios, you might want to test it out first and see how it works. But make sure you have a visual global gateway in place so users can opt out.
Yeah. Fair enough. Good. Thanks, John. There was a couple of questions around social, and you were talking about the use of social as a customer engagement model, which of course we see heavily used in the travel and hospitality industry. I think the best question that summarized the intent of most of them was, how are companies handling social feeds? What have you seen regarding instant translation? That's one of the challenges with user-generated content. What have you seen? Are people using machine translation, or are they scared off based on quality concerns? I don't know. What are you saying out there?
Well, I'm seeing a lot of companies testing it. Certainly, I think the best example of it in the wild, in terms of wide-scale implementation, is Facebook supporting real-time translation of the wall, so you can do that yourself. And the reason I think this is most relevant is that Facebook's effectively training users, that letting users know that this functionality exists. I think with machine translation in general, users are much more comfortable these days using it, and they understand the risks associated with it. They know they're not going to get the highest quality translation. But anecdotally, I know of a number of companies in the software sector, not specifically just the travel sector, who are going beyond machine translation internally as part of their translation workflow, but actually now unlocking it a bit and allowing users the leeway to self-translate content.
Right. Yeah. Certainly, I think something any of us engage in social or challenge with. So it's interesting to see what's happening. Along the lines of social, another question, and you sort of touched on this, I believe, with the KLM example. People are using it to engage with customers, and are you seeing good examples of brands embedding it or integrating it into their web for real-time personalization, for that real-time personalized experience?
I haven't seen that many examples to that degree where there's that degree of personalization. No, it tends to be more just a widget, if you will, that pulls the feed. There's not a lot of customization yet. There are examples of companies that are I have seen companies that are looking at a degree of doing that. It's more complicated because you need to sometimes need people to log in first before you can provide that level of personalization. But I think we're on the edge of that happening. But I don't have any great examples to share, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, fair enough. Probably an emerging practice. So maybe next year,
Yes.
we'll move the needle on that.
Right.
So you did mention obviously the global design templates as a best practice, but a question came in probably based on the global local balance that a lot of us manage internally inside our corporations. Meaning the sort of the political influence conversations you have. So the question was, do you have advice for convincing or influencing local offices to embracing global design templates where there's pushback?
Yes. There is often pushback on this, and there is often a sense from the local offices that they're being restricted by using a global template. Some ways around this: first, the process of developing global templates should first get local requirements from the local offices. They should be engaged early on so that they have input into the functionality, into the content that they want to see supported on these templates. And that actually will lead to accountability at the back end, because you need your local offices to have full buy-in and real ownership of the localized websites. I cannot emphasize that enough. Now, if you're still getting pushback, what I've seen a few companies do is they will first work with the offices that are heavily engaged, that do want to use the templates, and then let's say it's Mexico. Mexico has a successful pilot project. It works out well. You can then have Mexico present to the other countries. So it's less of a top-down, I'm telling you to do this. It's more of Mexico presenting to, say, France and saying, hey, look at, how much time we've saved, and now we can do such and such as a result of using these templates.
Good advice. I think you may have touched on this, and this is an interesting one. I'm looking forward to hear your answer on this. Someone asked, so compared to against other industries you cover, how does the travel stack up? Are we leader or laggard, and what's the major delta between us and other leaders?
Travel is ahead of a lot of sectors. It is I would say in the top 1/3 of all sectors. Definitely behind software and web services. Web services tend to be at the leading edge, and the reasons for this are languages. I mentioned that the travel sector is still relatively weak in terms of languages, which is really interesting when you think about the global audience that these companies serve and have served for many years, they're still relatively late to the party in terms of supporting languages. And I actually think that's a great opportunity for getting a competitive advantage. And I know, the margins are tight in some of these sectors, and I see that, but the fact of the matter is, once you see the winds blowing in this direction, and they are blowing pretty strongly, right now I'm seeing a few travel companies that are really upping the ante in terms of languages, and I think there's a year from now that average is gonna be quite a bit higher.
Good. I think we'll look at the clock. I think we have time for one more question. So I'm scrolling through quickly. Any thoughts on a global URL and domain structures for corporate sites that are memorable and extensible, such as corp.companyname.cc? I think they're asking about vanity URLs and extensions.
I think there are new domains coming and called generic TLDs, and you can, as a company now, register your company name. Google, Apple, Amazon are all in the process of doing this. It's expensive, but you could in fact have a dot Amazon at the top level, and that could be your global domain. It is really cutting edge, and there are a number of companies that have actually registered this with the intent of doing this. I think that's the most interesting thing. Now, as to a .cc, I'm less keen on that. I think country codes are definitely more valuable initially, but definitely look. If you've got the funds, to have that global top-level domain, that could, 5 to 10 years from now, be the global homepage. It'll be interesting. I'm not saying it's going to free you from having to register country codes, because companies still are doing that and need to do that for a variety of reasons, not just navigational, but from a intellectual property perspective as well.
Right. Makes sense. Thanks. You think let's squeeze one more question in, because I see everybody's actually hanging on the line.
Sure, yeah.
So somebody asked you, how do you think about near real-time human translation, parentheses online services to replace machine translation? So I think that's probably referring to crowdsourced translation. Have you seen much of that?
I don't see much of that on the. Well, I do see it from a customer perspective, customer support perspective. Yes, I think it's got great potential, obviously, because there are going to be customer support interactions where you cannot really rely on machine translation. You need a human involved, and I think in these scenarios, absolutely, there's a great market for that, particularly for travel companies that have a top tier of customers, have rewards programs. I know the airlines treat their top tier customers a certain way, and would easily justify having a service that provides this near real-time translation for them.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. Thanks for the honest answer. So I think we're coming up the top of the hour, so I do want to take a moment, John, and formally thank you once again on behalf of Lionbridge and everyone who attended today and who will access this session in its on-demand format for sharing some great insights with us. I'm sure everyone has learned a lot, and you've given us, as I said, a lot of food for thought, a lot of things that we still have to make decisions on and work through. But we really wanted to thank you on behalf of everyone and encourage everyone who attended to check out Byte Level Research and follow John online and for all the research that you do. And I know the global report is due to be released soon, isn't it?
Yes.
Right.
Thank you, Clint.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone, and have a good day.